This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Of course, today our speaker, Tom from City University of London, going to explain to us some new directions for historical research. Perhaps Tom will just go right to it. If you want to take it away. I see the projector's rolling and we should be ready to go.
Okay, well, thank you all ever so much for inviting me to come along. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk with you. Am I speaking loud enough to carry across the room? Thank you.
I think we should be on.
Okay, so as introduced, I'm Thomas Davies from City University. And a good portion of my work, I suppose, fits under this heading of transnational history. I'm an interdisciplinary academic who specializes especially in transnational social movements, transnational non-governmental organizations, transnational activism and similar phenomenon. I'm based in an international politics department, so my work crosses the boundaries between, I suppose, history and political science, and I incorporate in my work insights from both directions for research. In terms of my monographs to date, I've produced two, and they reflect contrasting dimensions to transnational historical research into, I suppose, voluntary action. And the first one was a study of a very particular case, that of disarmament campaigning between the two world wars. And it looked at peace movement activities in Great Britain, France, the United States, and at the international level, campaigning for disarmament through the processes of the League of Nations. So that's one way in which I've looked into transnational voluntary action history, is through a detailed single case analysis. So that was my starting point. And then my second publication, which will form the main basis for today's research, is a more general work looking at, it's a very sweeping overview of international non-governmental organizations over the last 2 centuries. So I conducted transnational research in terms of both the specific and the general. And when it comes to the new directions, many of these are offshoots from this second book on the history of transnational civil society, which was published December last year by Hearst, which is also on the screen, as you can see. So the way in which I will take today's presentation forward is to kick off by talking about transnational historical research, then moving on to introduce some of the definitional aspects, think about what kinds of sources are relevant to transnational historical research, especially in relation to international non-governmental organizations. And then move on to some of the sorts of ways in which I think my most recent endeavors in relation to the general history of international non-governmental organizations point towards areas that are worth exploring a good deal further. And you can see those bullet pointed on the screen. So looking beyond the the comparatively narrow range of international associations that have been the primary targets of research to date, looking at the transition that took place in the late 18th and early 19th centuries between what I term ancient and modern international NGOs, for want of better words, thinking about how these evolved beyond the European and the North American context where research has tended to concentrate to date. And thinking about, do we want to concentrate all our research in relation to successful cases, which has been the predominant characteristic of research in a discipline, or should we also look at failures? And my work has, both in my first study of disarmament activism and in this more recent study, has looked as much at, I suppose, cases of failure or only partial success as it has on those that might be the kind of totems of successful voluntary action, as I believe you can learn a great deal from failures as well as successes. So those are the things that I'll take us through today. I will kick off with this terminology I've been using, international non-governmental organization. The term originated in the UN Charter, and this was in Article 71 of the UN Charter in order to provide for consultative mechanisms between the United Nations system and actors other than governments. And so the UN's definition of NGO, or non-governmental organization, is a very broad one of any international organization not set up by intergovernmental agreement. But in UN practice, that's tended to exclude things like transnational terrorist groups or transnational corporate actors, and I followed that practice, like other authors like Peter Willits, in looking only at, I suppose, what you might call transnational voluntary associations. But I take a broader sweep than that, so it includes things like international federations of political parties, it includes international business associations, institutions like the International Chamber of Commerce that might extend beyond what you might traditionally call voluntary action, but I cover also in this history of international NGOs more traditional focuses of concern such as peace societies, international women's organizations, international labour institutions, and so forth. So that's the kind of key concept that I will keep referring to time and again, is NGOs, and specifically international NGOs rather than purely domestic ones. In the origin of the term NGO was originally centred around international rather than domestic associations, but more recently it tends to be applied at both levels. So transnational history is, I suppose, the field within which the study of the history of international NGOs constitutes a component, but is much broader than that. As many of you, I imagine, already are aware, this term originated in the 1980s in the work of authors like Akira Irie and Ian Tyrrell, who focus especially on transnationalizing the study of US history. And it's become particularly popular in the last decade or so, the Palgrave Dictionary of Transnational History, attempting to kind of, I suppose, survey the field. So transnational history is arguably a good deal older than the term that's been applied to this field of study that looks at phenomena that cross national boundaries, the history of phenomena that cross national boundaries. So if you think about subjects like the history of science, the history of ideas, these are inherently transnational subjects that have very long established presence. But other aspects are perhaps a good deal less, or had in the past at least been less well covered. So if you think about political history, traditionally the focus of attention has been within the national unit. And with respect to political history, transnational history aims to look at processes that cross these political boundaries, and international NGOs are one component of that. But there's arguably a good deal of other dimensions. So you have actors that cross international boundaries like international NGOs or corporations or terrorist groups and so forth. But you also have transnational processes such as globalization or migration. And these would all fall under this transnational history heading. Turning our attention away from the national unit of analysis to the transnational level brings with it some quite considerable challenges with relation to source materials, my second point on the screen. That if you're dealing with national political history, you arguably have quite well centralized, well catalogued national level archives focused on the institutions of the state that make for comparatively, well, not so much simple, but at least relatively straightforward locus for attention for national political research. If, on the other hand, you're looking at transnational actors, the diversity of source materials that you need to consult is a great deal broader. So in my work, one of the component parts that I have looked at is national governmental archives. They're important for a number of reasons. They're often the target of international NGO activity. For instance, if you think about the Disarmament campaign between the two world wars, the key locus of attention was very often the national governments attempting to persuade the foreign and defence ministries and the executives of the importance of changing national policy. So it's still important to consult national repositories because they are very often a target for transnational voluntary action. But not only in that regard, they're also useful, for instance, as a source of material on the internal activities of transnational voluntary actors or international NGOs. For instance, the ambassadorial establishments of states in various territories may report on the associational activities taking place in different countries that provide a source material on what's been taking place. So one of the most useful sources on the origins of the World Muslim Congress in the 1930s, for instance, is Foreign Office reports on these activities. So these obviously have the problems of the incorporating the perspective of the national governmental institutions that are reporting on these activities, but they do provide a resource that is available and reasonably well catalogued and so forth, has all the advantages of national governmental materials. But in order effectively to study transnational actors, transnational voluntary action, it's important also to look beyond these those repositories. So, for instance, one component element may be subnational level archives, but still, in the case of state institutions, so in London we've got the London Metropolitan Archives, where you have many voluntary association papers, including those that worked across national boundaries, such as the Royal Humane Society, one of the most established and ancient of humanitarian associations dating to the late 18th century. And then thinking beyond repositories of the state or sub-state level entities, you also have the archives of non-governmental organisations themselves. Sometimes these are located in the institution itself, if it still exists and if it's well resourced, like the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies has got a very well developed archival repository to which the researcher is enabled to access. It's well catalogued and they're relatively open. Alternatively, you find bodies of materials in university archives, but very often the papers of transnational associations can be very much incomplete, especially compared with, say, the national archives of countries like France, Britain, and the United States. So it's important to go beyond that, for instance, to the private papers of those who are active in transnational voluntary associations. So if you think about the interwar disarmament campaign, you've got the papers of Robert Cecil, for instance. And also, you can think beyond that in terms of the published records of the meetings of transnational associations. These are particularly useful in the 19th century, that in many of the international non-governmental organisations established in the late 19th century and earlier published the proceedings of their foundational conferences. So if you want to delve into the origins, or at least to get some part of the picture of the origins of these associations, then looking at these published proceedings is an additional aspect. You also have published annual reports, which are relatively available. So if in the absence of an archive of the NGO, you may still have the published materials of these international NGOs. Thinking beyond that to, I suppose, secondary materials, there's the material of the Union of International Associations, which I'll probably be returning to later, if I have the time, which is an important statistical repository on transnational associations. It endeavours to catalogue all of the international NGOs and intergovernmental bodies in the world. And for many, especially those looking at the history of international NGOs from a sociological perspective, this data, especially the records of the number of these associations over time, has been the key unit of analysis for looking at how has the phenomenon evolved over a broad historical sweep. So this data is quite useful for finding out what institutions were founded in certain years, but it does have considerable limits. It's an institution that was created in Brussels in the early 20th century, actually with the very bold initial objective of attempting to centralize all international institutions in a single world office, world centre in Brussels, which due to the onset of World War I was never to be achieved, or due to many other factors too. As a result, it's much more rigorous and comprehensive in relation to European associations established since the late 19th century onwards. But if you're looking into earlier periods, its data is a good deal less comprehensive. One of the ways in which I've attempted to find out about institutions preceding that date is, for instance, to search for keywords like international association in the library catalogues of major libraries like the French National Library or the British Library, which has helped me to dig up some institutions that have previously not been referred to either by the UIA or in existing historical work. Or another way of finding institutions that aren't already catalogued is to just follow in correspondence. If an institution that you've not heard of before is referred to, then you just follow the paper trail. So there's a number of different ways of finding these actors. And the Union of International Associations data is a good deal better on later institutions than it is on the earlier ones that I've had to try to find through other means. And then when preparing my more general work on the history of international NGOs, I've obviously had to rely in quite large part on secondary literature on particular organizations, individuals, movements and so forth. And so you have an existing body of literature on activists, on particular NGOs, and on wider social movements such as history of peace movements. So in terms of preparing my work, I've attempted to draw from each of these different categories of data, which arguably goes quite a bit beyond what one would have to look at if you're doing kind of national political historical research of the traditional kind. Okay, so that's kind of introducing transnational history and the sources associated with transnational history, and please do ask me any questions you might have about that. The second part of today's presentation is going to look at some of the themes that have arisen over the course of production of my two major monographs on this, the particular on the Disarmament campaign and the general on the history of international NGOs, and in particular I'm going to focus on the latter. So one of the things that I argue is challenges at least much of the conventional wisdom in relation to the history of transnational associations is that it goes back a good deal further than at least many have argued. Perhaps the most thorough examination of international NGOs is evolution to date is the sociological study of Bolly and Thomas. That starts in the 1870s. And it's quite common to use that as a starting point, and there's good reason for that. I'll just show you a depiction of some of the associations that were created in the late 19th century, roughly corresponding with the period of the Second Industrial Revolution onwards. Many of the best known international associations of the present day, international non-governmental organizations of the present day, were established at that time, such as the International Cooperative Alliance established in the 1890s, the International Statistical Institute, the International Actuarial Association, the International Publishers Association, International Literary and Artistic Association, the International Friends of Nature, the International Council of Women, the International Red Cross Movement, the International Olympic Committee. As you can see, the international NGOs that have developed at that point in time cover a huge range of activities. Some of them you might call voluntary activity, others international business associations like the International Publishers Association. This is the preeminent starting point, I would argue, for historical studies of the evolution of international NGOs to date. Is either they start in the late 19th century, or in a case especially of more political science-oriented work, they may often start even later, post-World War II. What I argue, and in contrast to that is that there was an important transition that took place in the late 18th and early 19th century between ancient forms of international non-governmental organisation and more modern forms. And to draw your attention to this, I've printed out for you two tables from my book, NGOs, A New History, which, if you have a look at Table 2 and Table 3, so that's the piece of paper with two tables on one side, and contrast some of the major international NGOs founded before the late 18th century and those established between roughly the 1760s and the 1840s. I would argue there's a quite considerable difference between those that are known to have been established in the earlier period and those that are known to have been established in the later period. So I identify an important transition that took place in the late 18th century. From ancient forms of institution like international religious orders, charities, missionary societies for certain, or societies, scientific societies that go back many centuries, and the much broader range of institutions that you can see in Table 3 that developed in the 1760s onwards. So I argue that there are three major differences between Table 2 institutions, the pre-mid-18th century institutions, and the Table 3 institutions. The first of them is evident, self-evident from Table 3. It's this considerable diversification of fields of activity. So you can categorize institutions by quite narrow fields of activity, whether it be anti-slavery or art, promotion of a kind of proto-communism, the saving of so-called foreigners in distress, life-saving societies, peace societies, and so forth. So one key difference between many of these institutions and the earlier ones is not only that they're more diverse, but also that they are more specialized in terms of their focus. So you can see one of these relatively narrow areas of interest listed in the third table. And a third difference in at least many of these cases is the trend towards secularization. So whereas many of the institutions in Table 2 are religious orders or missionary groups, charities, in Table 3 we see this increasing detachment of transnational associational life from a religious basis. So there seems to be an important turning point that took place from the 1760s onwards, and that became reflected in these three trends and reflected in this broad range of different kinds of associations that developed in that period. So amongst the earliest were the Transnational Network of Humane Societies that established in the 1760s onwards. But we also see in the late 18th century institutions set up in relation to exploration, such as the African Association, or anti-slavery in the 1770s onwards, as is reasonably well known. We also see in the early 19th century movements in relation to international health, like the Royal Generian Society, that was extremely extensive in terms of its scope. And in the context of the French Revolution, there were a wide range of different kinds of prototypical transnational associations developed, identified with a number of different individuals, some of those depicted here. So we have Nicolas Bonneville, who was one of the leading figures in the Universal Society of the Friends of Truth, which, although largely based in Paris, did have an international reach, as indeed did the Women Friends of Truth, a society that was led by a Dutch woman, despite being a largely Parisian institution. We also have the development later on by those who were active in the French Revolution of transnational institutions. So Marc-Antoine Julien de Paris, depicted in the middle there, active in the French Revolution and subsequently responsible for transnational educational or learned institutions like the Encyclopedic Society. And some identify the evolution of early communism with Buonarroti, who was important in both in the French Revolution and later on in his societies, centered around the promotion of equality, amongst other things. So we can see in the French Revolutionary context part of the explanation for this transition. But I would argue that there's a much broader range of factors than that. And one of the key aspects of the general history of international associations that I've put together is an attempt to disaggregate some of the different kinds of factors that are responsible for the emergence and also periods of contraction, as I'll get onto later on, of transnational associations. So there's the external political context, but there's also a wide range of other factors, scientific and technological. So this period of transition from ancient to modern arguably corresponds with the first industrial revolution. It corresponds also with social changes taking place in parts of the world, such as urbanization, the development of the social problems that were in part consequence of the first industrial revolution. I also argue that part of this process of transition from ancient to modern associations is the result of interactions between East and West. If we look at the International Shipwreck Society established in the mid-1830s, which called itself international by the end of that decade, one of its founders, Admiral Sidney Smith, depicted here, would emphasize commonly the importance of learning from the Chinese experience in rescuing people from drowning. And I would argue that learning processes that took place between East and West were also a part of this transformation that took place from ancient to modern associations. It's important not to neglect also, however, the significant role of the older forms of association in this transition. So transnational religious orders like the Quakers were highly central to some of these developments, like the creation of anti-slavery and peace societies. And quite commonly, some of these associations would adopt the models put forward by earlier transnational religious institutions. So, for instance, missionary societies with their model of setting up associate members in other countries was adopted by later more secular institutions. So it's important also to think about the links between what I've categorized as ancient associations and more modern ones. So one point that I would argue is important to take forward as an important kind of new direction or direction of research worth exploring further is this phase of transition from the late 18th to the mid-19th century that has in large part been neglected to date, that existing work has tended to concentrate on the 1870s onwards, the second industrial revolution onwards, and I would argue there's an important phase before that worthy of much further exploration. So that's one of the key kind of additional areas for research. In addition to that is the other point just above it, diversity of international NGOs. If you have a look at, say, the table number 4 of different kinds of NGOs established in the from 1919 to 1929, you can see that there's a significant range of international associations, and some of these have been better studied than others. So we have considerable work, say, on the international peace movements, on international socialism, for instance, but on other segments of transnational non-governmental action, we can see rather less existing research to date that perhaps ought to be worth taking further, especially in relation to international professional associations, which are among those listed here. So there's considerable variation between different categories of issue area research and how well it's been evaluated, and I think we should expand the range of associations beyond those that have been the core focus of concern to date. The third point that I feel is an area worthy of much greater exploration is in relation to actors beyond Europe and the United States. My own work is concentrated predominantly on those parts of the world. Those are the languages with which I'm most familiar, the sources that I've found easiest to access. But I feel that there's considerable scope for expanding further research into transnational voluntary action beyond the Western European and North American context. And if you have a look, for instance, at Table 2 again, which looks at the ancient associations, we can see, as even in the earliest phases of transnational action, we see transnational religious orders are not just, say, Roman Catholic religious orders, but we also have Sufi tariqas that are a significant part of the context of ancient transnational activity. Or if we extend into the history of transnational action into the 19th century, we see the importance of diaspora institutions like the East India Association and the Africa Association, both established in the late 19th century in London. Or if we move forward into the interwar period, this was an era in which there were undoubtedly many significant European, North American transnational associations established, but also an era in which we saw such associations established elsewhere. So, for instance, the World Society in Shanghai, created in the 1930s, the Asahi Glass Foundation in 1933, the Arachnological Society of East Asia, set up in Japan in 1936. So there's it's important to be aware that this is a process that was happening across the world, not only in the areas that have been most commonly of focus. And also, during periods when Europe and North America, as argue, has been at war, we've seen other parts of the world see relative continuation of expansion of transnational associational activities. So during World War I in Latin America, relatively unaffected by the conflict, we saw the creation of the Latin American Football Confederation, CONMEBOL, the Latin American Odontological Federation, FOLA. So we can see continuation of this activity in other parts of the world when there's a considerable setback in relation to associational formation in the European or North American context. So I think another key area that deserves greater research and has received attention to date is beyond the European and US context. And this is a phenomenon that is the importance to the evolution of transnational civil society is of developments beyond Europe and North America has continued into the present day in better known examples like the role of Bangladesh in the development of microfinance, or South America in relation to the development of the global justice movement. But I think these kinds of arguments in relation to the more recent period you might take further back. Okay, and I suppose my last point is in relation to what should we look at in terms of issues to do with successful cases of transnational voluntary action, of failed cases, and should we look at this as a linear or a cyclical phenomenon? And I veer towards the latter, at least to some degree, in relation to the pattern of development that I've identified. So you see phases of particularly considerable expansion, like the late 19th century, followed by eras of contraction, so the second decade of the 20th century. Then there's another phase of not inconsiderable expansion in 1919 to 1929, illustrated by the various institutions highlighted in table number 4 that I've handed out, also illustrated here. And again, these extend beyond the Western context to include institutions like the Muslim Brotherhood set up in the 1920s. And the third major phase of significant expansion that I identify as the 60s to the 80s, a much better known period of expansion of transnational associational activity associated with new social movement institutions in environmentalism and feminism. Also thinking about new forms of networking activity that developed at this time, so especially after the 1970s UN conferences and the development of new networking forms, including more southern-oriented forms of networking, such as the Third World Network that developed in Malaysia and Dawn. And at the culmination of this period, you see the end of the Cold War, and according to those of a fairly optimistic perspective, transnational voluntary action was a part of the process by which the Cold War came to an end, both from below in terms of human rights activism and its role in dissemination across borders of ideas that were challenging to the authority of Soviet or Soviet-modelled institutions in Central and Eastern Europe, and also from above in terms of peace movement activism and the movement for disarmament that is said to have been influential, and Gorbachev himself claimed was influential in relation to the disarmament treaties that ended, or that were a part of the end of the Cold War. But I argue that in each of these phases we see subsequent periods of contraction. So you have a phase of expansion in the late 19th century, followed by a phase of contraction in the second decade of the 20th century, a phase of expansion in the 1920s, followed by contraction in the 30s, and a phase of expansion from the 60s to the 80s, followed by a kind of a slowing down of growth and then a levelling off in the 2000s. And so one of the aspects of my book is to argue that you shouldn't see the evolution of international associations or transnational civil society in terms of purely kind of linear expansion that even in terms of numbers isn't seen, but as one in which we see periods of considerable activity and expansion followed by periods of contraction, and the kinds of factors that explain phases of expansion and phases of contraction I've summarized in Table 1. I referred to them earlier, but some of these have dual impacts that help, say, in the short term to facilitate expansion, and in the longer term to facilitate contraction. So it's quite commonly been noted, for instance, that the development of internationalism in the 19th century and of nationalism tended to go together. The national context provided a solid basis within which national associations could be formed and then in turn form transnational links, but also the processes associated with nationalism at the same time arguably helped contribute towards the First World War that was to have a detrimental impact, at least within the European and North American context. So I would argue that some of the factors that help in the short term to facilitate expansion may in the longer term facilitate contraction, and I apply that across a range of factors. I won't go through every single one here, but they are elaborated further in the book. And another key aspect, I suppose, follows on from that is the idea that it's important also to have a look at examples of, I suppose, failed transnational voluntary action. We're all familiar with success stories like the one I mentioned about contributing towards the end of the Cold War. But another example of this might be the bold ideas of the Union of International Associations established in the first decade of the 20th century, with its goal of centralizing, indeed in that building, all international associations to make Brussels, the capital of the world, with all international associations united under the banner of the Union of International Associations. An objective that was not to be achieved. And one interesting aspect of those who were active, especially Paul Otley in this institution, was that they promoted both national self-determination and internationalism, seeing the two as going hand in hand, whereas one might argue with hindsight that these processes were not necessarily as complementary as they had assumed. And so at the same time as the Union of International Associations was established, there was also a union of nationalities which aimed to promote nationalism around the world as a means towards national self-determination and, according to the ideal, a harmonious world because of the promotion of that goal. So that's one of the examples of failed activism that I think is important to bear in mind. Another example might be the Disarmament movement. This is a depiction of the ex-servicemen's institutions involved in promoting disarmament, FIDAC and CIAMAC in the early 1930s, that according to the, I suppose, the most radical argument, the promotion of disarmament in liberal states arguably was to weaken them in relation to the fascist threat in the later 1930s. It's an argument put forward by Winston Churchill. It's, and one might argue a fairly radical one, but nonetheless action of this kind may not always have consequences that are those that are paramount in the activists' mindsets. And just to finish off with an intriguing association that I'm currently conducting further research into, another example of failure is this International Shipwreck Society, initially called the General Shipwreck Society, which attempted to create a very bold international institution uniting life-saving institutions in all continents, in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. And certainly at the correspondence level it was successful in that, but it was to disintegrate rather rapidly in the early 1840s because one of its founders, Auguste God, who was the Secretary General of the institution, was alleged at least to have been using the institution as a means towards lining his own pockets. There are problematic aspects that I would argue are important to bear in mind, as well as the more beautiful picture of transnational voluntary action that also exists. I think I'll leave it on that note and open things up to questions and debate.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, perhaps I'll go first, so I'm chairing this session. That's a really interesting depiction of the evolution of sort of these NGOs and transnational organizations. I was really interested in your depiction of these periods of decline and resurgence at what were obviously times of great international complexity and discord on the political stage as well. And I wonder if the periods of decline and resurgence that you noticed correspond in any way to any intensifying or challenging political climate and discord between countries and even conflict. That is obviously a marked feature of the periods you've investigated.
Yeah. Should we go one question at a time?
Yeah.
Okay, so this seems to be a significant aspect, is the relationship between transnational associationalism and phases of war and peace, and the dynamic relationship between these phases. I wouldn't exclusively limit it to war and peace amongst all the other political, economic and social factors that are going on, but it's one of the key dynamics, is that phases of intense conflict can be productive to the generation of transnational associational activity. So following the Napoleonic Wars, the development of the peace movement and of many of the associations that I've highlighted of that early phase of the early 19th century, that context is in mind of the Napoleonic Wars. Similarly, during the First World War, especially towards the later phases, the importance of that conflict in the development not only of peace societies but also of humanitarian institutions and dealing with the humanitarian consequences of these catastrophes. So there's a kind of stimulative dynamic to conflict's role in the development of transnational associations, as well as the destructive dynamic by which during each of the two world wars we see contraction in associational foundations, especially in the earlier years, although quite also in the periods immediately preceding. But one of the more radical claims in the book is that transnational associations aren't just victims of their political context, they're part of these processes themselves. These dynamics involve these associations' activities too, as well as these associations being affected by the external context.
I'm interested in how a national association becomes an international one, like you have Save the Children, for example, started in the UK in 1919, but then became an international federation to Save the Children. These are all ones that come out of the humanitarian association. Oxfam in the Second World War starts very much as a UK organisation in Oxford, but then afterwards expands into an international Oxfam structure. So it looks to me as if united ones which are deliberately funded to be international, like say the Brussels group, but others which start from a national base and then see the value of not just being national. So they devise some structures whereby they can, even if it's just a federation of national bodies, they can start to describe themselves as international.
Yeah.
Would that be fair? There's like two different directions.
I would absolutely agree with that. The study of international NGOs, I suppose really began seriously with the Union of International Associations in the early 20th century. But the first book specifically on international NGOs was Lyman Cromwell White's study of the structures of what he termed private international associations or private international organizations. And he, in his very earliest work specifically on the topic in the 1930s, argued that you can identify a number of different types that evolve. So one of them, as you identify, is the cosmopolitan structure. So an institution that is intended to be international from the outset and is international in terms of having a membership of those from across the world. Then there's the Federation of National Associations, and so you have the national institution uniting into the transnational. You also have hybrid institutions, and those can come in the form of both. Those are the hybrid, part cosmopolitan membership, part federation. And there's also hybrid in the sense of part governmental actors, part non-governmental actors, part cosmopolitan actors. And then in turn, you also have the super international non-governmental organisation like the Union of International Associations, by which international NGOs themselves create their own international NGOs, like the UIA, or in relation to more recent periods, we have the period of the League of Nations. We had the creation of the Federation of Private International Associations in Geneva to lobby the League of Nations. And there can be a number of different kinds of driving factors behind this. So there could be the shared interests of the national federations, or there could be the preeminence of cosmopolitan ideals that leads to the creation of...
Is this in your book?
The rationales, there is this is the reasons for the creation of institutions are quite commonly cited as one of the things I've attempted to focus in on in this book is why were particular organizations established, and it varies considerably even within those categories you've identified. It's not something I've generalized about very much in this particular book. There is some political science work. I think it's John Baguli has written something about the internationalization processes of NGOs that kind of applies models that have been applied in relation to business, international corporations and the different drivers, whether they be political, economic, social, they're not actually all that different from the factors that I've disaggregated in relation to the evolution of transnational civil society as a whole. But that's what this book concentrates more on, is the broader picture evolution explanation than the individual associational evolution.
You've answered my question.
Anything else? No?
Well, it's just, if I can come in again, the Brussels bit fascinates me, and I'm looking at a bit of Belgian Congo at the moment. Really, in the first decade of the 20th century, King Leopold's fiefdom was taken over by the Belgian people as it's 1908. But you're now showing me this amazingly idealistic association, which seems to emerge about the same time, and is no doubt connected in some way with Belgium's sense of empire.
Yeah.
Which was in a state of transition at the time.
There was this. It wasn't just driven by private actors. I think they saw an opportunity to try to make Belgium, because so many international associations had already been established there, they saw an opportunity to try to give Belgium a more significant role. And that was one of the ways. Your mentioning of the Africa Association is another interesting feature that is mentioned in relation to a number of organizations in my book, is this the role of exploitation of associationalism by governmental actors. So this is one of the clearest examples of that, the governmental actors exploiting this trend for their own end.
Any other questions or comments, John?
I wonder whether we might include social media as part of the very, very modern NGO. Today's Evening Standard, we've got Prince Harry and Prince William asking people to join up and send emails to protect wildlife. Then you've got also a campaign thing led by John Kerry and other people, end rape as a plea in warfare, end rape in war. And that Pakistani girl that was shot and almost killed in Pakistan, and she came to London, had surgery, and she's now trying to forward education in Pakistan. And you can do this in London. You can sign on, as I have myself. You can join me. So I wonder whether this might be a thing in the future.
I think that you've identified one of the important ways in which it's important to note that we haven't seen it all before in the past. I wouldn't want people to take that from the book, that there are new things happening, and the significance of social media is one of those. I would argue that it's been particularly significant in speeding things up, making things quicker. But many of the sorts of things that are facilitated by social media we have seen in the past, but taking place more slowly. So petitions, such as you mentioned, online petitions, is something we have seen transnationally before. In my work on Disarmament, we saw women's institutions gathering 12 million signatures around the world. It took them several years to do it, whereas now you can do that within a few days. But nonetheless, transnational petitions were possible in the past, but certainly social media has helped speed things up. There are issues associated with this, such as some would argue that it's a form of slacktivism, where all you do is press a button and that's it, forget it. Slacktivism. The kind of that it doesn't involve much effort in terms of mobilization. There's also the issue of access to this, that those with relatively considerable wealth have much greater access to these resources than those with less substantial wealth, so it may reinforce some forms of inequality.
That's an interesting one, because of course we had the campaign, I forget what it was, which David Cameron was made to hold the Twitter hashtag on NGO or something, but it's not really an organisation in the same way, and indeed the intended recipients of that goodwill or that voluntary action perhaps might not have access to social media to see that people are campaigning for this, and therefore it might fall short of the regions in which it's intended to have an impact, versus an organisation that was set up and administrated with an office and documents in the archives and such. I suppose that was, of course, a question. Any other questions?
Well, there are issues of language. I mean, this is fascinating, but there must have been, before the EU, lots of translations into French around this one of the that were bringing in English speaking. There must have been some difficulties, some issues getting things properly translated and understood.
That ties into the resource issue that the better funded institutions could afford to disseminate transcripts of their proceedings in multiple languages, whereas others, they may only have been able to have just kept their own records internally. There's been an evolution in terms of the preeminent languages of these institutions, that French was greatly more common before World War I as the common discourse, and most of the, at least of the European origin International Association documents of the pre-World War I era were in French. Amongst the labour movement, German was significant right up until the Second World War, and in the subsequent period, English has become more significant. But you might also argue that other world languages have become more important too. So Arabic is a common transnational language with the expansion of Arabic associations, especially since World War II.
Well, perhaps we should leave it there and retire for more informal discussion over a glass of wine. I'm pleased to report we appear to be overstocked for wine, as far as I can make out. Yes, perhaps we can all thank Tom for giving us that.
Thank you for your attention.